lead developer Austin. How is everyone? Awesome. Very cool. I love the city. I love being able to be here. So thank you so much to the organizers of Lead Developer for having me. So I am an engineering manager at a company called SalesLoft. I lead our data and analytics teams as well as our API and integrations teams. And as was mentioned earlier, I also founded the Atlanta Network of Women Who Code in 2013. And with whatever free time I can muster, I also organize conferences. So last year and the year before that, starting in 2017, I organized a conference called We Rise, where we focused on showcasing women in technology. And next year, we'll be co-organizing a conference called Refactor Tech, which focuses on showcasing underrepresented and marginalized people in tech, but also hopefully creating a space for some really good conversations around diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. So what is SalesLoft? SalesLoft is a startup in Atlanta that is a little bit too big at around 350 people to call itself a startup, but we like to still think of ourselves as startups, as a startup. And so we build sales engagement software. We help sales teams be better, smarter sales teams. And so we help them set a rhythm for how they're reaching out to their leads and their prospects and really kind of come up with information and data around that. So how can you reach out to this customer in this way? How can you reach out to this lead in another way at the right time in the way that they like to be contacted? And so this is a quote from Patrick Lencioni. There's going to be a lot of Patrick Lencioni. Our co-founders are kind of in love with all of his books. And it says, if an organization is intolerant of everything, it will stand for nothing. And this came from actually one of our all-hands meetings where our CEO was addressing the shootings in Charlottesville. And first of all, it was the first time I had worked at a company where the CEO was brave enough to start a really kind of complex conversation around race, and I really appreciated that. But it also showed how much he cared about our culture, that he wanted to make sure that some of the accidental things that wind into our culture in our everyday lives don't find themselves in our culture at SalesLoft. And so that was a lot of what that conversation was kind of regarding. And just to kind of get a feel for the room, how many of you have heard a company or an organization has great culture, but when you ask what makes that culture great, they can't really give you an answer? Heard that before? That's because they haven't really defined their culture. And that great place to work likely happened by accident. And what's really telling is when there are troubles or when you have to change culture or move away from some kind of accidental culture in some way, and there's no guideline for fixing it because, again, it hasn't been defined. So how do you define your culture? You do that through your values. And so there are 4 different kinds of values. Your permission to play values are the minimum behavioral standards that are required in an organization. Some examples of permission to play values are things like honesty or integrity or respect. Core values, on the other hand, are behavioral traits that are inherent in an organization. Core values lie at the heart of our identity. They change very rarely and must already exist. In other words, they can't be contrived. They cannot be extracted from that organization any more than you can extract a human being's conscience from that person. And so permission to play values must be delineated very clearly from core values to avoid diluting your core values and being too generic. You probably wouldn't want to have core values around being honest, for instance. You would definitely want to dive deeper into the culture. Aspirational values are characteristics an organization wants to have, wishes it already had, and believes it must develop in order to be successful. These are qualities that an organization is aspiring to adopt and will do its best to manage intentionally in that organization. However, they are neither natural or inherent, and so you have to really work at them. You have to be intentional about them, which is why they must be purposefully inserted into the culture. Then there are accidental values, which our CEO was warning us about. And these are traits that have come about unintentionally and don't necessarily serve the good of the organization. They may be behavioral tendencies that develop over time because of just the history within the organization, or because people start to bring in a lot of people from similar backgrounds. The question that needs to be asked here is whether this has been cultivated for a purpose or whether it came about accidentally. It's important that we guard against accidental values. They can prevent new ideas and people from flourishing in an organization. Sometimes they can even sabotage that organization's success by shutting out new members and new perspectives. So what do we do with values? They should be used to guide every aspect of the organization, from onboarding to offboarding to strategy to product development, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So you want to make sure that you identify and describe both your core values and your permission to play values. And you want to be intolerant of any violations to both your core and permission to play values. You want to ensure that every activity, every hire, every policy that you reenact, that everything reflects those core values. You don't want to hide from your accidental values. You want to, if there are positive accidental values that you want to contribute to the culture, then you want to convert those to aspirational values. But if there are accidental values that are not helping you support your core values, then you want to make sure that you call those out and you de-incentivize people actually acting out in the accidental values. And you want to work aspirational values into the fabric of your organization. And so I mentioned that our co-founders are huge fans of Patrick Lencioni, and they read this book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's become kind of the Bible of the sales-off culture. And it talks about how these 5 dysfunctions really keep teams from becoming those high-performing teams that we all seek out. And it all kind of starts with this absence of trust. And because there's no trust, you can't have healthy conflict. And so there's this fear of any kind of conflict. And that creates not the harmonious situation that you might think of when a situation is absent of trust. It creates an artificial harmony that people haven't really bought into, that people haven't really been able to contribute their ideas to. And so you get to this lack of commitment because people did not contribute any ideas to what you decided upon. They didn't get to talk through the things that they had concerns about, so they don't have any commitment to the decisions that were made. And so there's some ambiguity around any of the decisions, any of the goals that you set at that moment. And because there's a lack of commitment, there is now an avoidance of any kind of accountability. No one wants to take responsibility for this because they weren't involved in making the decision. Their thoughts and their concerns weren't taken into consideration when those decisions came into play. And so this breeds low standards across the organization. And because we have this avoidance of accountability, we now have an inattention to results. And so this actually helps people who kind of lead or move with status and ego, but it doesn't really help you achieve your results. And so it really kind of creates this toxic team that is not high performing. And so what our co-founders did was kind of turn these around and turn them into the 5 functions of a team, of a high performing team. And so again, we start with trust. And once we kind of built that trust, we're not afraid to have conflict with each other because we know that we're not attacking each other personally. We're just trying to find the right solution for the customer or the right solution for this particular problem. And so now that we've engaged in that healthy conflict, we can commit to the decisions that are made because everybody got to come to the table with any concerns and got to weigh those and got to resolve those issues. And so now we can all fully commit. And because we're all committed, we can hold each other accountable and focus on achieving collective results. And so we came up with these core values as a result of kind of going through the 5 dysfunctions of a team and determining what was really important to us. And those 5 values are putting customers first, team over self, glass half full, focus on results, and a bias towards action. But how do SalesLoft's 5 core values actually influence the work we do as an engineering team? Another engineering manager on our team wrote a great blog post, which I have a link to a little bit later, about how the company core values might tie into technical decisions or how we work together to build features. In his post, he thought back to a question of how our core values affect our day-to-day work. He would say, the core values are a set of filters in my mind, and each time I prepare to take an action, I test my intentions against those filters. I may or may not modify my actions or my message, but this ensures that my actions fit the core values. Seems legit, but that doesn't really get into how they tie into writing tests, or how do they affect making a decision that to try a new architectural pattern. So in order to tie our larger core values to our engineering team performance, we created guiding principles, our 3 core tenets of engineering. And this allows engineers to keep correct practices of teamwork and execution in mind as we're doing our work. And so the first 2 I want to kind of draw your attention to is we want to build things well, and we want to build things fast. We want to build really high quality features, but we are actually still a startup, and there's a lot of competition in our market, and so we have to get these things out to our customers really quickly. And so how do we kind of manage that tug of war between building something really well and building something really fast? And the way we do that is to build that as a team. So teamwork becomes hugely important to making sure that we're delivering exactly what we want to our customers. And just to look a little bit into our coding process, an engineer would create a branch off of master, and then there would be some kind of pairing. And this happens throughout the process, by the way. So this could be between 3 of our software engineers, which are full stack engineers at SalesLoft. This could be between a software engineer and a UI engineer, or a software engineer and our QA engineers, even our product owners. And so this happens throughout the process. Then the engineer would submit a pull request, run automated tests, and then at that point, another engineer must thumbs up it. And yes, we do use the emojis because we're still that weird. And then the designer must come through with a design review and give the paintbrush emoji. And then we go to QA where we get the star emoji, and then we can merge to master. And so something you might have noticed in the previous slide is that I called out kind of pairing and the part where engineer must thumbs up a pull request. And that's to kind of address that there are 2 kinds of code reviews happening at this time. So we have pairing, which we do a lot of. We're doing that constantly throughout the development process. And you can have a few different ways that you're pairing. You might do driver navigator type of pairing, or you might do ping pong pairing, where one engineer might write a failing test, and the other engineer has to write code that makes the test pass, and they switch it off. So you might see some of that in the code review process. And you might also see kind of an asynchronous kind of code review that you see when you're using things like GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. And so just going through that code review process, that actually seems like a lot of work. And we mentioned that one of our core tenets was building things fast. So why would we want to add more steps to the process? Well, code reviews give a lot of benefits. Just to look at a few. It really helps us understand readability. Readability is going to be hugely important to maintaining this code base over time and making sure that the whole engineering team can actually understand what you wrote. And so you need to get another engineer to say, this makes sense. Really working through architecture and design decisions are some benefits that code reviews bring us. Catching bugs before QA and production is another benefit of code reviews. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then knowledge transfer. Oftentimes, the engineer, or this is the case here, that the engineer that is giving the thumbs up has not worked on this particular code base. So you're sharing that information with new engineers every time you request a review. But really what this boils down to is that it helps us have better technical conversations. And those technical conversations really drive our engineering culture. And so we're going to talk about some ways that the engineering culture is influenced by code reviews and how code reviews can kind of reinforce our engineering culture. And so we mentioned those 3 core tenets of our engineering team, building things well. So how do code reviews help us here? Well, if you already have these established standards, then you can use code reviews to check against those. So is your code solid? Is it dry? Are you making sure you're not repeating yourself? Are you making sure you're not building things that you're not going to need later? Are you making sure that you are reducing complexity in the code base rather than adding to it? Are you looking at style guides? Are you making sure that there's test coverage? In terms of permissions and security, one really cool example of this is our architecture team wants to make sure that they get to approve any changes or database changes or data migration changes. And we've been able to use the code owner's GitHub feature to ensure that only the architecture team has permission to make those approvals. And so when it comes to building things fast, what do code reviews give us here? And it goes back to catching bugs as soon as possible. Not just catching bugs, but catching any misalignment with requirements as well. And so this chart is just showing you the hours to fix a bug based on its introduction into your development process. And you notice the further you get into your development process, the longer this is going to take to fix. Most software engineers would vouch for the research showing this, that the problems found early during design or coding can be fixed many times faster than when they're found later in production. So catching bugs earlier on makes them faster and easier to solve. This is extremely important when you get to misalignments around requirements, because those are often much more complex to fix rather than just a defect that has been noticed. But where we find real gains with code reviews and our culture is building things as a team. Again, I mentioned that knowledge transfer. So the way our teams typically work, we have 3 software engineers on a product team, and 2 of those engineers might be working really closely throughout the process to work through the feature development. And the other engineer is likely going to be the person who thumbs ups it because they didn't have any involvement in the code development. And so you're making sure that even though that engineer was not involved in the development of the feature, they understand what's happening. They understand why you made certain decisions. They're going to be able to ask those kind of questions during the review. And then externally to a development team, you can bring more awareness of changes and reduce the silos within the company by asking for reviews outside of your team, by asking developers outside of this team to thumbs up this particular change, especially if there's some overlap between their different product surfaces, and they get to understand what you've been developing as well, so you don't have to go to the same engineer every time when you want to maintain this feature. Code reviews set the tone for the entire team that everything we do should be open to scrutiny from others, and that scrutiny should be a welcome part of our workflow rather than seen as threatening. This tone reinforces our culture in a few different ways. First, it establishes that no person or team is free from critique. Code reviews are classless at Salesloft. Being the most senior person on a team does not imply that your code does not need review. So our principal architect, who wrote most of our earliest code, still needs a thumbs up on his pull request. He still pairs to work through solutions instead of dictating them. And this means that everyone on the team is responsible for holding each other accountable and enforcing our coding standards. Next, code reviews help us learn how to give and receive feedback. We learn over time the best ways to critique code so that our suggestions are actually addressed. And then on the other hand, we learn to process and incorporate feedback so that our contributions are accepted and merged. And this really gets back to the core values and the kind of the cultural Bible of Salesloft, where we're looking at the 5 dysfunctions of a team. We want to make sure that we have enough trust to engage in the conflict necessary to resolve a lot of the things that you see in a code review. And we want to make sure that we are committed to making sure that our code adheres to the standards that we want in our code base. Also, because everyone is responsible for giving code reviews, it really promotes collective ownership of the code base. There's no one person that is the gatekeeper for a particular feature or a particular product surface or anything within the code base. We all own this code together. Code reviews aren't only a place for critique. They should often be used as a place to recognize well-thought-out solutions and high-quality code. Sometimes in our one-on-ones, I really like talking to engineers about pull requests they're very excited about or very proud of. And throughout the comments, you can just see their peers praising them for a really clean solution or really thoughtful refactoring. This also promotes collaboration and gets to that healthy conflict. Teams really need the opportunity to work through different perspectives and to resolve that conflict. They will never become a high-performing team if they don't figure this out. So having that exercise frequently in code reviews helps us move towards being a high-performing team, and also often finds alternative solutions to the original presented. And mentorship opportunities abound with code reviews. Because everyone is responsible for code reviews, everyone gradually gets comfortable being either a teacher or a learner in this system. During a recent one-on-one with one of our engineers, we were talking about his growth since joining the company and how his code is leaps and bounds better than the code he was writing 2 years ago. One of the factors he attributed his growth to was getting better about asking questions. He mentioned that because our principal architect, I mentioned earlier, and his tech lead are so kind when he approaches them with questions, he now sees questions as opportunities where he can learn from this rather than be embarrassed by this. This is exactly the kind of culture we're striving for, and it's just one example of the power of code reviews have to shape your culture. We really encourage asking questions and guiding through code reviews instead of just telling an engineer what to do, especially if you look through kind of asynchronous code reviews. If you're telling an engineer what to do, you might as well have just added that, right? So why would we want to just tell an engineer what to do in this asynchronous process? We want them to learn and grow. We want to be growing the people around us. So ask questions to guide them towards different solutions rather than just telling them what they should do. And then this is hugely important for junior developers, but you really want to help them learn how to discuss things technically. When they're in code reviews, they're understanding the jargon that comes with a lot of what we do day to day, and they're understanding how to explain things technically, and they get better and better at it as they review code. So let's walk through an actual pull request from one of my teams. And so the first thing I want to point out is context. Context is hugely important when you start this process. So you get context from the title of the pull request, from the descriptions, from the commit descriptions. And so you want to make sure that that is something that really makes sense to people. And also you get context from the labels that you see on the side, data mob and ready for review. So ready for review tells us that it's time to review this, that the engineer feels comfortable putting this out for review. And data mob is the team that should review it. And I mentioned earlier how code review should be a process that also encourages and shows recognition for really well done code. And so I really like this interaction that we're seeing between a senior engineer on the team and kind of a mid-level engineer on the team, where he's praising him for the use of instance doubles immediately. And then he mentions a little bit later that not in this PR, but we should start to look at refactoring some of this. And that's crucial because the refactor is not something that mid-level engineer affected. So we're not saying you have to fix this entire code base, but we do want to draw some attention to it. And then this kind of back and forth, this conversation that's happening here is really more of that guiding and that coaching and kind of asking questions to figure out what is the purpose of the code review, of the code that was written. And there are questions asked. There's nowhere in here where the senior engineer dictates this is how it's done and this is just how we do it. It really encourages the mid-level engineer to get involved in the process of determining the future of this code. And so just want to go over a few best practices for code reviews. You really want to think, does this code accomplish the author's purpose? Every change should have a specific reason, whether it's a new feature, a refactor, or a bug fix. Does the code actually accomplish this purpose? And since it's best not to assume that purpose, you definitely want to ask questions. Again, functions, classes should all exist for a reason. When the reason is not clear, this might be an indication that some refactoring is needed or maybe tests are needed. Does the change follow standard patterns? Established code bases often have existing patterns around naming conventions or program logic decomposition. And so you want to make sure that you are following that because it helps everyone in the organization agree upon this code and be able to read it. Then you want to, again, think through your reading experience. Were you able to grasp the concepts in a reasonable amount of time? Did the flow make sense and were variables and methods easy to follow? Does the code adhere to coding guidelines and style? You also want to check for, does this code add to technical debt? If it does, you definitely want to create a different ticket in your ticketing system so that you can address that, so that it doesn't start to build up, as technical debt tends to do. And do you want to make sure that you respond to every comment, even if it's something as simple as saying, I acknowledge this, or this has been addressed. You want to make sure that you respond to every comment. A few things to avoid. You want to avoid asking a teammate to review a monster PR in general. You want to try to break up your PRs along functional lines as much as possible, but if you must submit that monster of a PR, make sure that you give some context to the reviewer. Have maybe a pairing session where you can discuss the problem you're solving and the motivations behind your design decisions before they go into your pull request. You also want to avoid overwhelming a requester with an avalanche of comments. You want to avoid stating opinion as fact. You want to make sure that there are design guidelines and patterns throughout the code base to support what you're telling them to do, because you want to make sure that they understand why this is happening, and just your opinion is likely not enough to bring them over to understanding what they need to do. You want to avoid asking judgmental questions like, why did you do this here? Questions really should be used to gather information and to coach. They shouldn't be used as a mechanism for attacking another engineer. And you want to make sure that you are not ignoring toxic behaviors, especially from your high performers. There was a lot of talk a while ago about like 10x engineers. And that sounds great, except that in a lot of cases, that 10x engineer can be very toxic to the larger community. And so if they are taking away from the rest of your engineering team's ability to ask questions, to feel safe, to have that psychological safety they need to innovate, they are taking away from the team and therefore may not be that 10x engineer that we all think they are. So you want to make sure that if you have that person that is super high performing individually, that they aren't taking away from the team culturally. And just a few points to consider. Culture is a constant work in progress. At SalesLoft, we like to think of this as a living, breathing entity that we have to continue to contribute to. Code reviews create a platform for a lot of these really interesting technical discussions. And we must be engaged citizens of our engineering, our code base, in the same way that we are engaged citizens of our engineering culture. And here are just a few resources. And please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be here for office hours at 11:20. Thank you.